Good morning and welcome to the Eastern Iowa Agronomy Update out in the Answerplots Part 2. I'm your anchor, Tyler Steinkamp, agronomist for Winfield United.
I'm your co-anchor, Andy Dickus, technical seed agronomist with Winfield United.
This morning we're going to be covering some key factors around when to harvest alfalfa for the peak nutritional content of that alfalfa and also the key factors that affect our overall nutrition in the alfalfa. We'll also be covering some key insects and diseases that affect our alfalfa crops.
Also, later on, breaking news, it's tissue sampling time. So we'll be covering the how, the why, and the what for tissue sampling. Also, we'll be covering below the plant. What sort of things can you be doing now for roots? What sort of considerations you need to do? What sort of things do you need to be looking for?
One of the key stories we've been following lately is around response to nitrogen. Which hybrids are we following? What are the keys to identifying the correct nitrogen rate for our nitrogen applications?
And then we'll get a report from the field from our own Adam Murray with his tech update talking about tissue sampling and the how-to get that on your smart devices.
So with that, let's send it out to the field and learn a little bit about alfalfa management from Tyler Steinkamp. So let's talk a little bit about alfalfa harvest timing. You really can't go off the height of alfalfa. Obviously, the taller the alfalfa plant is, the more tonnage, but really we have to time it based on the stage of that alfalfa plant. Now, if you look at a lot of these alfalfa plants right now, we really don't have any blooms or buds on them yet, so we're a little bit early for harvest, but we're getting close. Once that plant starts to bud or starts to produce those blooms and you're just seeing it start to produce that initial bud, that's when we're going to see the highest quality of that alfalfa. Okay, now it's not the highest tonnage, but it's the highest quality, and you do play a little bit of a balancing role between tonnage and quality. Okay, so if you're looking for really high quality alfalfa, you're going to want to take it in the bud stage. If you're looking for more tonnage, you're going to want to wait until you get to that bloom stage where you actually have blooms on that plant. That's when you're going to see the best tonnage. Now, there are some exceptions to that rule. For example, if you planted Harv Extra alfalfa or alfalfa that has that Harv Extra trait, you can let that grow into that bloom stage without seeing the reduction in quality that you have with some of these other alfalfas. So that's one thing to consider. You want to be, again, as close to bud stage in alfalfa for really high quality. For more tonnage, you want to be closer to that bloom stage. And then cut that off and start watching it as it regrows for some of the other insects and diseases that might come in. Thanks, Tyler, for that update. You are truly outstanding in your field. Up next, we're going to talk a little bit about disease and insects in alfalfa. So to send it back out to Tyler out in the field. After we've made that first cutting, it's going to be really important that we continue to evaluate these alfalfa stands and look for any signs of insect feeding and diseases that may have started up after that first cutting. Now, we even with this first cutting have some of that as well. Great way to identify it is using a sweep net, and that's where a majority of our thresholds are coming from here. The key is you want to sweep just that top couple inches of the alfalfa plant. You will get a little bit of alfalfa down in the net itself, but that's okay, you can sort through that. Usually I do about 10 sweeps because that's what a lot of my thresholds are based off of single sweeps. So for example, potato leafhopper, if you're getting a half a potato leafhopper per sweep, that's what's going to be your threshold. Now, obviously, you're not going to get an actual half of a potato leafhopper, but if you count out 10 sweeps, if you have more than 5 potato leafhoppers, you know that you're going to have to make an application. And guys, this year is setting up to have some pretty good insect pressure. We've already had quite a few reports of alfalfa weevil farther north than I've ever seen them. So make sure you're watching for that, because that insect in particular can defoliate alfalfa very quickly. And alfalfa is worth quite a bit, so make sure you're watching that. Once you have that sweep taken, okay, you're going to slowly start opening this up and start to look for insects. Now, with potato leafhopper, the reason I grabbed this bag is because they do hop. They are as advertised. Potato leafhoppers hops right out of this net. So you're going to have to be counting them as they come. Oh, there goes one. See, so I got one already out here. Okay. So we'll continue to watch. Oh, there goes another one. So I got two. Okay, once I start getting down into here, then it becomes a little more challenging. You have to start looking at the alfalfa itself. One thing I notice, I actually have a lot of aphids in here. So there is a fair amount of aphids that are coming down on this alfalfa. So that in itself might warrant an application. But then in combination with that potato leafhopper, which I only saw, there's another one there. And there's another one right here. So we got 4 in here, and I swept probably 4 or 8 times there. So realistically, we are at threshold for this field for potato leafhopper, and I am seeing a little bit of burnout here, but not much. The thing about it is, though, with this alfalfa stand, we're so close to cutting it, we're not going to make an application here because we're going to be up against that pre-harvest interval. Okay, but what I would be telling this farmer is that he needs to be watching this field after cutting. You get about 4 to 6 inches of regrowth out here. Take your sweep net, sweep it, make sure that we don't have enough potato leafhopper. My guess with this field is we're going to have threshold levels of potato leafhopper to spray and make applications. Now, you're going to want to do that more than once, because just because you don't have them quite threshold in one area, you might have it in another. So check a couple different areas there, but make sure you're watching for this insect, because I do think this second cutting of alfalfa we're going to see quite a bit. Okay, other things to be watching for. One thing I noticed out in this alfalfa stand, especially with how nice and thick it is, we are getting some septoria brown spot towards the bottom part of this leaf. That can really cut down on our tonnage down in this lower canopy. And remember, where's our forage quality coming from? Well, it's coming from these leaves. So if we got a bunch of foliar diseases down here at the bottom of that plant, you very quickly reduce the quality of your alfalfa. Okay, so if you're already spraying an insecticide, throwing in something like a headline or some other fungicide that's labeled on alfalfa might not be a bad idea, especially with how thick this alfalfa stand is. Beautiful stand of alfalfa. Okay. Another thing to consider is alfalfa is very responsive to micronutrients. In fact, it is the most responsive crop of any crop that we deal with here in Iowa, it is very responsive to micronutrients, especially things like manganese and boron. So making an application of those micronutrients can really help spur that growth on. So make sure you're checking your alfalfa, especially after that first cutting. 4 to 6 inches of regrowth. I know a lot of people are out looking at corn and soybeans at that time. Make sure you send somebody out to look at this alfalfa for insects, diseases, and throw a micronutrient in with that tank mix.
Thanks, Tyler, for that update on those pesky insects and the diseases that we're seeing out in the field. Now we're going to go back out to Tyler Steinkamp, and we're going to get a breaking news update on tissue sampling and what sort of things we need to do going forward.
Thanks, Andy. Yeah, we're truly following a developing story right now here out in the field. We're getting very close to when we're going to be taking tissue samples. Now remember, our key timing for taking tissue samples is from V4 to V5 on corn. We want to get it just ahead of that grand growth period so that we know what kind of nutrients we have going into the grand growth period. Now when you're staging corn, you always want to look at the bottom leaf here, and you should have a rounded tip leaf. That's always going to be your first leaf, is when you have a rounded tip. If you don't have a rounded tip, whether it's fell off because of frost or any kind of damage there, we know that that's not the first leaf. Okay. Also remember, you're counting the collars, you're not counting the leaf. So if I look at this plant right here, I'm counting the number of fully developed collars. So we have a V1, V2, and And this one's just developing now. It's almost V3 corn. Now this kind of weather, corn can put on a new leaf every 4 to 5 days. So we're going to be in that key tissue sampling timing very, very quickly. Now how do we take a tissue sample? Well, it's that first most upper developed collar that we're going to pull off and use for that sample. Now this is after V4. If you do take a sample before V4, so V3 and before, we have to take the entire plant. Okay, but my recommendation would be is to wait till that V4 to V5 time period, because that's when you're going to get a more accurate sample. And at that point, we're just going to be taking the uppermost developed leaf at that point. Okay, and what you want is you want a softball size sample. And you're going to be sending that softball size sample in to the lab there. Okay, and what you're going to do is you're just going to come up here. Thanks for holding that bag, Tyler. You're going to come up here, you're going to grab that bag, and you're going to put it in there. Put these in a box. Now what I'd recommend doing, don't leave this on the dash of your pickup. Make sure to get it in a cooler or something overnight, and send it off as soon as you possibly can. My recommendation would be to take tissue samples on a Monday or Tuesday, maybe even Wednesday, and get them sent off as soon as possible. You don't want them sitting in a UPS truck over the weekend. Okay, so get them sent the first part of the week. Usually it's going to take between 2 to 3 days to get some sort of result back and be able to analyze that sample. Okay, of course, later on we're going to look at making sure that we have the right app on our phone, but make sure you're actually entering the information that you need. And I would strongly recommend filling out the information on the bag to avoid any issues if the app doesn't work quite properly. Now, when you do get your results back, what you're going to be looking at is something like this. Okay, and this is what I call a radar chart. Now, a radar chart, it indicates where your nutrients are at. Okay, of course, green is good, yellow means, oh, I'm on the edge, and red means you're truly deficient. Okay, and these tissue samples can really help you identify what nutrients you're truly deficient on in that plant. Okay, and the value of this is, we did a study back in 2011 looking at all of our different NutriSolutions tools, and we sprayed Maxin ZMB, which is a foliar zinc, across the top of all of the plots. Okay, we had 51 locations that did this study. Across all 51 locations, we averaged about a 2.5 bushel yield increase to putting on foliar zinc. Now overall, that's pretty good, especially in the economic environment that we have. However, if we looked at the 33 sites where we were truly deficient and that tissue sample came back deficient, we ended up having an average response of 7.5 bushels to zinc. So that just shows the value of those tissue samples is by having that tissue sample, you can narrow in on what you're truly deficient on. The same was true with boron. Boron, across all the plots, the average was right around 0 bushels. There's really no response. But at the 29 sites that we were actually deficient in boron, we had a 5.9 bushel response to putting on a foliar boron. So the tissue sample really just does a great job, and it's a truly developing story as we start looking at crops getting close to this tissue sampling time. It's a truly exciting time. So back to you, Andy and Tyler.
Thanks, Tyler, for that update on the breaking news of tissue sampling going on right now. Now we're going to go for a fascinating update on what's happening below your plant with the roots of your corn plant.
Next segment, I wanted to talk about the roots of a corn plant. And in particular because right now we have a lot going on down below the ground. First and foremost, when you start digging up corn plants, we can establish what the true planting depth was. Now, with it being a cooler spring, and particularly a drier spring, we had a lot of tillage that happened that maybe shallowed up that corn plant a little bit. When I start looking at this, the soil line was right about here. So if you look at the depth that we planted, this was right at about 1.5 inches. So we were just a little bit shallow even for corn. Looks like it came up pretty good, but we should have been just a little bit deeper. You're right on the edge there. If we're less than about an inch, that's where we really start to run into problems. Okay, but overall I wouldn't be too concerned about this. Other things that are going on down below the root or below the ground right now. First of all, if you look at just these roots right here, so the ones right below the seed, these are what we refer to as our seminal roots. Okay, and these seminal roots are the first ones that came out of that seed. They're what supplies our nutrient demands of that crop until it gets to about V3, V4. Okay, then we start to transition over to these nodal roots. The reason I bring this up is as we start to transition from our seminal roots over to our nodal roots, one of the things you're going to start to see is that this plant might yellow up a little bit, especially with us going from cooler conditions to now very warm conditions. You got to remember, corn is driven by heat. So with corn being driven by heat, it's going to develop at a different pace. For example, if the above ground temperature is quite a bit warmer than the below ground, my above ground part of that plant is going to grow very, very quickly, whereas my below ground part of that plant is going to be fairly slow to develop. So over the next week to week and a half, what you might see is this corn plant might yellow up a little bit. Okay, I'm not too concerned about that. Over time, it will green back up, especially as it starts getting into the nitrogen and those nodal roots really start to develop. Where I do start to see more of an issue is in corn on corn situations. Okay, because with corn on corn, the combination of switching from your seminal roots to your nodal roots is also going to be compounded by the fact that now we're starting to break down the corn residue from the previous year. And when you start breaking down the corn residue from the previous year, oftentimes the nitrogen and sulfur that's needed for that crop will actually be utilized instead to break down the previous crop residue. So that could be an issue. Overall though, I would say these roots look really, really healthy. We have been getting a little bit more rain in some areas. I'm really excited about the yield potential that we have for this. And really the roots do look pretty good, and I think we're going to have a pretty good year for corn yields. So with that, back to you, Andy and Tyler. Man, that was truly fascinating learning about below the plant. Coming up next, we're going to talk a little bit about response to nitrogen. So over to you, Andy.
Thanks, guys. I'm going to be updating us on response to nitrogen, as to why it's important and just some key things as to what we're looking at. So what is response to nitrogen? As we take a look at response to nitrogen, it is Winfield United's way of using our answer plots to make sure you as salesmen have the upper hand when it comes to nitrogen management of specific hybrids. And so when we take a look at this, how do we do it? So it's going to be differing as we go forward. So this year, the scores are based off of one thing, and next year, the scores are based off another thing. So I'll get into that. So this year, as we take a look at the scores that you will have this year and what they're based off of, it's based off of a limited going to an unlimited and the yield difference between those two. And then we rate the hybrids by maturity on the bottom third is low, the middle third is moderate, the top third is high. And so as we take a look at that, going from unlimited or limited to unlimited, we'll go from roughly 60 to 100 pounds of N up front, total pounds of N, going to unlimited. So 250 plus, depending on the yield goal that we have at that specific answer plot. And so then we take that and we take the yield based off of those limited and unlimited, and those high deltas are going to be the higher, the moderate deltas are going to be in the middle third, and the low deltas are going to be in the low third. And so that's really when we take a look at this. So how do you use that as you're looking? So take a hybrid Cropland 4203, for example. It is a high responder to nitrogen. In 2020, it came back of upwards of 85 bushels at being a high responder that we could get going from limited to unlimited. That's a pretty big response, especially when we start talking $5, $6 corn, correct? Now on the low side, we get in the low 60s. And so by going from unlimited to limited, which is somewhere between 100 to 150 plus pounds of extra nitrogen, and we're only getting 60 bushels extra on that. And so we look at a product like 4444, that's a low responder to nitrogen. That doesn't mean you don't want to put nitrogen to it. It's just that if you're going out there and you're rating the fields on what fields you're going to apply nitrogen first because you got a rainstorm coming, or you don't know if you're going to be able to get all of the fields done before this crop gets to a point where you can't do some side dress, we're going to go to those high responders like a 4203 over a 4444. So when we start looking at a response to nitrogen, that's how we're going to use it going forward for this year when it comes to side dress. Now, going forward, we're actually going to go from 2 nitrogen rates up to 3 nitrogen rates. So for 2021, we're actually going to have 3 nitrogen rates. So the answer plots that we have this year, we have 3 nitrogen rates, and that's what we're going to base our response to scores off of. And so what we're trying to do is get more of a response curve out of it instead of just 2 dots on a line, right? And so that way we can better understand where that point of diminishing return is a little bit closer to these hybrids. So stay tuned with that. Our data is going to look a little bit different. We did change up our response to scores, and that's how we changed up our response to nitrogen. So back to you, Tyler and Andy.
That was some great information on response to nitrogen. In our final segment, we're going to pass it over to Adam Murray for story time about ag technology.
All right, everyone. Welcome to Story Time with Adam Murray, the Digital Technology Manager for Eastern Iowa. And today, we're going to go over the NutriSolutions tissue sampling app and making sure you guys all have that downloaded. Now, the first thing I want you to do, whether you have an Apple phone or an Android phone, is go ahead and go to your App Store or your Google Play and type in NutriSolutions and download the NutriSolutions app. Once the app is downloaded, go ahead and log in with your credentials, your standard Winfield United portal credentials. Then once you get logged in, it's going to bring you to that first page, and make sure you select your radius. I would like it to typically keep it around 25 miles, because if it goes any bigger, it gets to be pulling in a lot of information. And also make sure you drop a pin on your location so it knows where you are to pull in the local grower's information to your app. Once you do that, hit sync and save. Now, once you've gone through the whole process and you kind of get to the actual tissue sampling stage, I would see below in our description of this video, that's where you can find some different resource documents on how to actually tissue sample and utilize the app when you're out in the field. Now, a couple things to think about that I can go over is what are some things, I guess, some key points to look at when you're out tissue sampling. Now, the first thing is when you drop those pins in that field, please be sure that that pin is dropped within the boundary of that field. We want it to be able to stay in there so we can geographically reference exactly that point. Also, when you go ahead and name the field, you can never be too detailed when you're naming your field and naming your sample. It can become really critical to know exactly where that sample was taken. You don't get it mixed up with another sample from another time. Okay? Now, when you're making work orders, it can be done inside the NutriSolutions app. It can also be done inside of R7 as well too. So you have a couple different places of where you can put these samples. All right, is everybody listening? Anybody got any questions so far? All right, Andy, you're sure you're good to go? You have no further questions? All right, well that's great. Now a final couple things to think about is make sure you have plenty of bags on hand. If you don't, reach out to your local Winfield United representative and they should be able to help you out in getting some fresh bags for you. And again, if you have any questions or you want to learn more on how to do some of these things, just go down to the description below and hit one of those links and kind of refer to some of those documents that are attached. So thank you guys for joining Story Time with your Digital Technology Manager, and I hope you learned, or this is a good reminder on how to use the NutriSolutions 360 app. Back to you.
Well, that concludes our broadcast for today. We went through and talked about alfalfa management, went through and talked about nitrogen management and how to identify your nutrient deficiencies with your tissue samples. We also talked about how to actually send in a tissue sample. So those were some of the key things that we're looking forward to in the next couple weeks.
And tune in next week for our third of 4 Answerplot updates. And you stay classy, Eastern Iowa.
No? Okay. Andy, are you sure? Okay. All right. Again, look below in our descriptions. I can't do it, dude. Oh my God. Oh, I can't do that. Now, brown cow. Scotch, scotch, scotch. Down into my belly.
Ha 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 ha.
That was really loud.
All right, are you rolling?
Yeah, it's rolling. You just gotta come up with stuff.
Okay. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck chuck? Oh, whoa.
Yeah, you do need warm up.
Yeah. How much wood could a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood? Probably not much in this environment.
No, probably not much at all.
Wood's very expensive.
Unique New York. Unique New York. I can't. I need. That's why we update.
Yeah,
That's why we.
exactly.
We are recording. Go ahead. Chris, I see your shoulder. Thank you.
Yeah, that's true.
We've gotten good takes. You just
Right.
don't need to. 'Cause I don't know if it's realistic to think that we're gonna get through the whole thing without a mistake.
It is.
Well, you have no faith in us. You're totally accurate. Okay.
It is recording.
Oh, okay.